I've always wanted a MacBook, but I could never really justify the price. And to make it worse, my iPad has been doing it for me just fine, so I never really had a clear answer for what I even need a MacBook for. Maybe I just wanted macOS, maybe I fell for Apple marketing, or maybe I just needed a reason to sit in a Starbucks and feel productive. Well, anyway, Apple just dropped this thing for $5.99 and kinda made the decision for me. So for a week I ditched my usual setup and only used the MacBook Neo. I wanted to see what I actually like about it, what annoys me, where it fits, and whether this is genuinely the Mac most first-time buyers should get. Now, this is Apple's cheapest MacBook, and cheap usually means that sacrifices were made. However, they definitely not have been made when it comes to its build quality. As soon as you take it out of a box, it gives you a feeling that it costs just as much as a MacBook Pro. From the unboxing, the metal build, the thinness, the way the lid opens, it all feels properly MacBook. Apple hasn't cheaped out on how it feels whatsoever, and I think that is a very good decision because lots of people buy Apple's hardware primarily for the aesthetics, and this MacBook genuinely feels way more expensive than the price suggests. I guarantee you nobody's going to look at this thing and instantly think, oh, that's the cheap MacBook. And by the way, this also translates to the user experience as well. The screen, the keyboard, and the trackpad feel just as solid, even though these are some parts that they've cut corners on, but you don't feel that unless you start comparing it to the higher-end Macs. That said, corners have been cut. Like, for example, it's using an iPhone chip, which funny how that works, because the iPad now has a Mac chip, yet they run different operating systems. Well, anyway, this is the part that matters most, because aesthetics is one thing, but the real question is whether this thing actually feels usable once the honeymoon phase is over. So for the week, I treated it like an actual laptop and browsed on it, watched YouTube, made this video on it, and yes, I also did the completely necessary Starbucks test. Now, jokes aside, for regular everyday use, this thing is honestly kind of ridiculous. For browsing, writing, watching stuff, and just using it as a normal laptop, it feels blazing fast. And I don't mean fast enough for the price, I mean actually fast. There is basically no lag. Tabs open in split seconds and they stay instantly active and responsive even when lots of them are open, and the whole system feels light on its feet, exactly the way you'd expect a MacBook to perform. After just a single day of use, I had completely forgotten that this thing comes with an iPhone chip and only has 8 GB of RAM. And if you really think about it, this is a new MacBook, so it's supposed to get at least 5 or maybe even 7 years of macOS updates. So it's not me stuck with an iPhone chip and 8 gigs of RAM, it's Apple's problem to figure out. And so far, it looks like figure out they have, though normal use is the easy part, so I wanted to see what happened when I pushed it harder. Editing 4K video with color grading is genuinely doable on it. The playback has also been working just fine, and it has been able to keep the editing app open alongside my script and Safari tabs while I jump back and forth between everything. That said, Apple has not invented some magic here. 8 GB of memory does eventually make itself apparent. For example, if you're doing heavy work on it, like editing, tabs that have been inactive for too long may start refreshing once you come back to them. Though the good news is that it happens fast enough that it's not really annoying, but it's still one of those little things that the MacBook Neo is managing around its limits once you start stacking enough stuff. And this is also where the difference between capable and enjoyable starts to show. After a while, if you've been pushing it, the MacBook also starts feeling less instant when heavier apps are open alongside more tabs and background stuff. It still keeps everything open, it still works, it still stays responsive, but sometimes it takes a second or two before it really lets you do something in a newly open tab when the heavier stuff is already running. After having color graded this video on this MacBook, I can't honestly say the experience was enjoyable, but it still got it done. This is the key distinction, but again, it's not meant to be used for heavy work to begin with, so the fact that it can even manage that is already very impressive. To put it simply, this MacBook can do more than it should for the money, but it also clearly reminds you what it was actually made for. And that pretty much sums up the whole machine. Now, there's also things that you'll just have to live with. Not in a catastrophic way, but in a very Apple way. The more I used it, the more I started noticing where Apple very clearly made sure this thing stays in its lane. The funniest example is the missing keyboard backlight. At first, it was one of those classic Apple omissions, but the more I used it, the less funny it got. It doesn't make the MacBook unusable because the black on white contrast is good enough that you can still see the keys most of the time, but it becomes genuinely annoying pretty quickly. And weirdly, it can also make you want to raise the display brightness just to see the keyboard better, which then hurts the battery life for a reason that should not even exist. Then there's only 3 ports, which are also very much just enough. You get the headphone jack and 2 USB-C ports, and only one of them is USB 3.0. The other one is much slower, so you'll want to use it for charging mostly. The webcam is also just fine. It is 1080p, and I do like that it's integrated into the bezel instead of using a cutout like the Air and Pro, but the actual quality is just okay. Even in good daylight, it can get soft and grainy, especially in the shadows, and it loses details faster than I would like. There is also no center stage, which I personally don't care about because I never really use it anyway, but if that's something you like, it's missing here too. Honestly, for meetings and family calls, it does its job, but that's about it. Then the speakers, they sound full enough for YouTube, movies, and casual music, and most will probably think they sound completely fine. But they try to compensate with loudness to cover for the lack of clarity, which is kind of annoying. Again, they're not terrible, but not great either. Though, let's be honest, you're probably gonna use headphones anyway. Now, battery life. It's definitely not the battery life that MacBooks are praised for, so don't expect a week out of it. It's more like 2 to 3 days of regular use, which also might be a reason why it's missing a backlit keyboard. That said, it still comfortably gets through a full day that includes occasional editing and heavier workload, which is already fair considering this machine was never really built around the heavier, sustained creative work in the first place. But speaking of creative work, there's the display too. It looks beautiful, but it also doesn't fully cover the P3 color range, which even the cheapest iPad mini does. That's to say that it's not suited for color work, though in real-world use that mattered less than I expected somehow. I color graded this video on it, and it looks pretty much the same as usual, give or take. And finally, only the 512GB version gets Touch ID, which honestly is a must-have, and I also suspect that 8GB of RAM will make themselves a lot more apparent on the 256GB version, because it most likely uses memory swap to compensate for the lack of RAM, and when your 256GB SSD gets filled, which it will, you're gonna have a very bad time, so you kinda have to get the 512 one. That makes the adjusted for storage price more like $699, so yeah, compromises are real. Though most of them feel less like deal breakers and more like Apple making sure you know why the Air costs more. At this point, I already kind of know one thing. This is probably not going to replace my PC, and it's probably not going to replace my iPad Pro either, but that is a me problem. My setup is not normal, and my workflow is not the one this thing was built for. The more important question is whether this MacBook is an absolute banger for first-time buyers, students, parents, and anyone who just needs a good laptop for normal, regular, everyday life use. And I think this is where this MacBook really wins, because it handles browsing, documents, emails, and all the usual everyday tasks without being annoying. So for $599 or even $699, it becomes ridiculously easy to recommend. It's kind of a no-brainer, honestly. This MacBook is way better than its price suggests. It feels premium, it is fast for normal tasks, it handles light creative work better than I expected, and most of the compromises only really start to matter once you compare it to much more expensive devices, or start asking it to do things that it was never built for. So should this be your first MacBook too? Honestly, yes.